Hello and welcome back to Management 201, Introduction to Professional Management. Today we talk about strategic and operational planning, different kinds of plans, how we approach them, when we emphasize what. So the plan for the session is we'll introduce those different kinds of plans that organizations need to develop. We'll talk about situation analysis and how that affects your plan. And then we'll talk specifically about different kinds of strategies that companies may develop to make sure those plans get realized. So we'll identify corporate level strategies, business level strategies, and operational level strategies or functional strategies that have to do with operational level planning. And finally, we'll touch upon time management very briefly. What is a good idea when you uh, start planning your time? How do you structure your time to make sure that most of your objectives are met? So there are lots and lots of challenges for most of us right now because most of us are overloaded with different things, and we need to identify which of them do require our attention and which of them we should really ignore. So we'll talk about that. But first of all, strategic and operational planning as such. The main difference between strategic plans and operational plans is the time horizon. With strategic planning, we talk about long term, so something that takes longer than 1 year to accomplish. So, strategic planning itself, the process includes developing a mission, long range objectives, and determining in advance how those objectives will be accomplished. With operational planning, we'll look at something that takes less than 1 year to accomplish. And so, again, operational planning is the process of setting short range objectives and determining in advance how they will be accomplished. So, the primary distinction is just the timeline. Planning is done at three different levels: corporate level, business level, and functional. Corporate level planning has to do with where we compete. Right, so corporate level strategy generally tells you which markets, which industries, and sometimes which geographies your business is going to operate in. Business level planning is something that's one level below. Here you answer the question how you will compete in each of those markets or industries that you have identified as important to your company in the previous step. And then finally, functional level strategies, they deal with specific functions that you need to employ to make sure that your business level plans are actually, whatever you've planned that you can achieve. So here we'll look at things like marketing strategy and maybe HR, finance. So all those different business functions that we have identified previously, they would be addressed at the functional level planning. In terms of who does planning in organizations, that depends on what kind of planning we're talking about. For strategic plans, typically you have upper and mid-level managers involved. The scope of those plans is typically broad. And again, as I said before, in terms of time, they are long range. And typically, with strategic plans, these plans are single use. You develop those plans for projects that are rather unique. So let's say you want to build a new facility or you want to expand into a different country. So those major projects are unlikely to repeat in any similar fashion in the future. So for each of those projects, you require a separate plan. Operational plans, they typically developed by mid and low level managers. They tend to be more narrow in focus and specific, again, short range in terms of the time horizon. And these kind of plans are a lot more likely to become standing plans, right? So you do not throw them away after the project has completed because the next project that is very similar or perhaps identical is likely to emerge within the company. So it's not a one-off thing. This is something that you will be using and reusing as time goes on. The strategic planning process involves 5 different steps, and they are all interconnected. So it all starts with developing the mission, analyzing the environment, and then setting objectives. You do not set objectives without understanding where your company needs to get going and without understanding the constraints that you can find in the external environment. We did touch briefly on the notion of external environment and all those segments of external environment. So you remember, right, the task environment and the general environment, industry forces and general forces. So you need to understand the constraints that they put on your business, as well as the forces of competition that are present within your industry, because that will determine what's doable, what's not doable, which of the factors you need to emphasize when developing your strategy if you want to succeed, and how you can possibly exploit whatever attractive it is that you find in the industry. So that becomes a key element of developing a strategic plan. And then from that, you go on to basically develop those strategies, corporate level, business level, and functional level. And then you move on to implement and control. And this is probably the first time when we talk about control in this course. We will talk about that a lot more towards the end of the semester. You remember that control is a very important management function. Without control, there's no proper implementation. You need to make sure that company stays on track. And for that reason, you have to have a way to assess whether or not the plan is actually being followed and whether or not it leads to the kind of results you're expected. So situation analysis, this is something that pertains to the external environment. This is where you look at the industry analysis and competitive situation analysis. And you remember that notion of 5 forces of competition that we introduced probably during our second session. So you remember that industry could be attractive or unattractive or maybe moderately attractive. And attractive industries tend to sustain rather high profit margins. Industry attractiveness is subject to those 5 forces of competition: threat of new entrants, availability of substitute products, intensity of rivalry within the industry, and then bargaining power of buyers and suppliers. And based on how these 5 forces are aligned, successful strategies will demand certain things of your company, right? The strategy that you want to implement in a specific industry almost always depends on how these forces are aligned, and from where you may expect to see some threats emerging, and where could be those opportunities that you can capitalize on if you align all your resources properly. Then you do the company situation analysis, and you start with trying to assess the present strategy based on performance. This is where many smaller companies, startups, will actually find themselves in trouble. They do not know what the strategy is. Every firm actually follows some kind of strategy, but unless it was developed consciously, people in charge may not be able to verbalize it, may not be able to formally describe it. So first order of business is you have to think carefully about what your current strategy is. And then you look at the company performance, most likely compare it to the other firms in the industry. And by doing that, you come to a conclusion as to whether or not your current strategy is fitting with your resources and capabilities and the opportunities and threats in the external environment or not, right? Whether or not it requires a change. So to that end, you conduct a formal SWOT analysis. SWOT is an abbreviation. It stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Strengths and weaknesses are 2 dimensions that are attributable to your internal resources, capabilities, and competences. Opportunities and threats is something that comes from the external environment, and typically it has to do with the changes in the general environment. These changes could be of different nature, right? So you remember those segments of general environment that we have described previously, economic, political and legal, socio-cultural, technological. So any change in those segments uh, affects the equilibrium across different markets, makes certain resource combinations more valuable and others less valuable. And that potentially has implications for what you need to protect yourself against and what kind of opportunities you need to target. And by doing SWOT analysis, you try to establish some sort of a correspondence between those opportunities and threats on the one hand, and your resources and capabilities on the other hand. So they go hand in hand together. It makes very little sense to do one without the other. So you try to assess your competitive strength, obviously. You reach a conclusion concerning your competitive position, and then you try to identify issues and problems that need to be addressed for the company to move forward. Finally, here at the situation analysis, you try to identify what gives your company a competitive advantage. This is something that is typically associated with a business level strategy, also known as a competitive strategy. And effectively, you try to isolate core competencies that your firm may have. So, I guess in a nutshell, right, all the firms have control over some resources, and the way they combine those resources towards certain ends endows firms with capabilities. And some of those capabilities will be quite unique. Others will be generic where everybody else has them. So those capabilities that are unique, they are known as competencies, specifically core competencies. And it is these core competencies that can give you sustainable competitive advantage. Again, we do not emphasize it here in this class, but this is basically what you want to do as a strategic manager. And in your Management 497 class, the strategic management class, the last one you take before graduation, we'll be talking about that in a lot more detail. So, as you try to identify your core competencies, you look at the company's present and into its past, right? You need to understand where you currently are, what gives you the strength, what enables you to compete and survive and hopefully prosper. You also look into the future, and when you do that, you try to benchmark your company against some of the rivals. The idea here is that you don't really need to reinvent the wheel all the time. You can simply identify the companies that are already successful doing something that you want to be doing and you imitate them, right? So you find the best possible imitation target. You try to develop what kind of resources you need to develop those same capabilities and competences, and then you do that. But you don't want to do it in the dark. You want to find some targets that you want to imitate. You set them up as benchmarks, and then you move towards the future with those benchmarks in mind. Now, goals and objectives. So far, we did not really distinguish between them. It turns out that there are important differences. Goals are rather general, right? They broad targets to be accomplished. So we want to be an industry leader. That would be a goal. Or, like Google says, to organize the world's information. So that's a goal. Objectives are a lot more specific. And to set up proper objectives, it is a good idea to follow the SMART acronym, where S stands for specific, M for measurable, A attainable, R realistic, and T timely. So all of those, if you want your objectives to be actionable, to really drive your performance, you want to make sure that when you formulate objectives, they follow this SMART acronym. And so when you write your objectives, basically what you want to say is, there has to be a verb, there has to be a specific and measurable result, there has to be a target date. For instance, you may want to say that our objective is to increase our sales by 20% by the end of 2021. Right, so that would be an example of a properly structured objective. You cannot say that we want to be an industry leader because that does not really have an actionable verb. It does not give you specific and measurable result. So what exactly constitutes being a leader? And there is no target date, right? So properly written objectives have to follow this pattern. This is very important. So please keep this in mind. You write those objectives for companies. You also write those objectives for people that you manage, that you supervise. And management by objectives refers to you using those objectives that you write for the individuals to make sure they do what's expected of them, that they do it well, that they correct their behavior if it needs correction. And to that end, management by objectives imply three important steps. First of all, you do set those individual objectives and plans, and you definitely communicate them to the employee. If the employee doesn't know what's expected of him or her, then you failed already. There has to be absolute clarity. What needs to be done, how you're going to measure it, by which date it has to be achieved. So all of that has to be laid out. Step two is you give feedback and evaluate performance, not just at the end, but also throughout the process. Whenever you set up some objectives, right, even if they are operational in nature, even if they are not long term, it's typically not something that the employee will do in the next 5 minutes. It is usually something that will require quite some time. Your feedback as a manager is absolutely essential. It has to, reinforce that employees understanding that, this is indeed what I need to be doing. Or if the employee is doing something incorrectly or not quite to your expectations, that has to be communicated as well. And then third step, you reward the employee according to performance. Right, so sometimes those rewards are positive. It could be some monetary compensation, profit sharing, maybe an extra day off or something like that. Or it could be negative, something like punishment, up to and including termination. But you cannot really do that unless there are properly set objectives and plans, and unless there's been feedback and evaluation of performance, because otherwise it will just seem completely random. People have to understand what's going on to really do their best for the benefit of the company and of your shareholders. Speaking of strategy, as I said, there are different ways to look at strategies. We may distinguish between corporate level, business level, and functional strategies. There's also an approach known as grand strategies, based on the overall program, overall plan you have for the company. And here we distinguish between four possible grand strategies: growth, stability, turnaround, and retrenchment. Growth strategy is rather aggressive. Here you attempt to increase the company's size through increased sales. And you want to do that actively, you want to do it with passion, I would say, and growth then becomes almost its own strategic goal. With stability strategy, you basically try to maintain the company present size or perhaps grow slowly. Generally, this is not the best way to address strategy. Because in strategy, our goal is to outcompete our rivals. At least some of those rivals will be aimed at growth. And if the industry itself is not growing, it means they will grow at your expense. So, stability strategy is, I know some companies do pursue it, and maybe in adverse conditions, this can be understandable. But basically, if your industry grows, there are very few contingencies that would justify just trying to maintain the status quo. still companies use it. Turnaround strategy is something that you develop if your business has been through some rough times. So here you try to attempt to reverse decline in business as quickly as possible. So it could be that your company has been taken over and the new management comes in and tries to figure out what goes wrong and maybe let some people go, divest some businesses, reestablish the relationship with suppliers and buyers and whatnot. Or maybe you yourself do that because you do not want to become an acquisition target, or maybe because you do not want to go bankrupt. And finally, retrenchment strategy. This is primarily you primarily develop it if the business is not doing well. And here you try to identify the assets that you need to divest or liquidate. So not only the assets that you have are making money for the company and for the shareholders, yet it probably costs you money to maintain them. So if you can find a strategic buyer for a specific class of assets or specific resources that destroy the value for your shareholders, that's definitely great. So this retrenchment strategy is something that you should consider in very specific economic circumstances. If we talk about growth, right, so obviously this is the most attractive strategy. How do we possibly do that? There are three ways to approach it. First, a so-called concentration strategy. This is aggressive growth in the existing lines of business, meaning that within your industry, within your niche, you occupy larger and larger space. So this market concentration will grow. A bigger chunk of that market will be controlled by fewer companies if everybody pursues this kind of strategy. It can be done organically, right? You may just try increase your sales. It may be done through maybe acquiring competition, but we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Uh, it definitely helps with easing competitive pressure and rivalry intensity if you can attain that larger size while your competitors stay smaller. You may also grow through integration. And there are two kinds of integration strategies that you may consider: forward integration and backward integration. Forward integration has to do with entering a line of business closer to the final customer. So, for instance, if you are a computer chip manufacturer, rather than selling your chips to to Dell, and Dell then assembles computers and sells them to the customer, you may decide to actually put computers together yourself. So that would be an example of forward integration. You go one step further to the final customer. Backward integration is obviously the exact opposite. So now if you're Dell and you want to integrate backward, then you would acquire a manufacturer of those computer chips. So obviously in today's world, when Intel is a corporation that controls about 90% of all the chips for computers, it's very hard to imagine that any computer, the companies that assembles computers will be able to take it over. But to just illustrate the principle, that's effectively what it is. And then finally, you may grow through diversification. So you're not trying to grow within that same line of business. You're not trying to integrate backwards or forward. You try to diversify. And diversifications come in two types: related and unrelated. With related, there is at least something that businesses could share. It could be either technology, could be the market, could be, well, any number of things, some capabilities that you may share across different businesses. So, if you are, I don't know, if you are Caribou Coffee, and then you decide to also serve teas or maybe some bottled drinks, that would be an example of a related diversification. So when Starbucks started selling those cappuccino drinks in partnership with Pepsi through grocery stores, for Starbucks that was definitely an attempt to diversify into a related market. Unrelated diversification is where you go into markets that have absolutely nothing to do with where you are currently. So, if you are, I don't know, a jet ski rental place, you may also try to open a car detailing business on your premises so that people who come to you to rent jet skis for a couple of hours may also have the car detailed while they are using jet skis. So there's really nothing much in common between the businesses, except that you have this captive customer for a while, or maybe you're in business of drilling for oil, and then you decide to sell ice cream, right? So it's as unrelated as it can be. So those kind of diversification moves are known as unrelated. And typically, related diversification moves are successful. Unrelated moves are typically not successful. So just something for you to keep in mind. And again, we'll talk much more about that once you become seniors, once you take this Management 497 strategic management class. Growth itself, as I said, you could do it organically by just, either increasing your sales within the same product market or developing this new line of business on your own. But more often than not, it's done through mergers and acquisitions. So rather than developing this new set of competencies from scratch, you simply acquire a company that already has it. Or maybe they are in the very same industry, maybe they are your competitor. So rather than fighting with them head to head, you simply acquire them or you merge with them. There is a conceptual difference between merger and acquisition. Merger is basically an integration of equals. And here, owners of stock in each company would receive new shares in the new company under its new name. With acquisition, there is always an acquisition target, and then there is an acquiring company, right, the purchaser. So here, this purchaser, the acquiring company, buys all or part of another business, and then stock owners in the target company receive shares in the purchaser's stock, right? So this acquiring company survives, the acquired company does not. So people who used to own the target company now become shareholders of the overall company that has acquired the target company. Uh, with respect to deciding which lines of businesses to keep, which lines of businesses to divest, there are many strategic tools that can be employed. So this one, the so-called growth share matrix, I think it was developed by McKinsey, is probably the best known one. So if you are a diversified company, if you operate across many different markets and you try to figure out, which ones to keep, which ones to divest, a good idea is to look at two dimensions: market growth rate and relative market share. If the business you have happens to be in a market that grows fast and you control a big chunk of that market, these are stars. You definitely want to keep them. They do generate a lot of money for you that you can reinvest. You can, support other projects. You can funnel it all back into the same market. So these are great ones to have. The businesses that where you do control a big chunk of the market, but the market kind of slowed with its growth, they're called cash cows. Um, in a sense, because the market does not really grow fast at all, maybe it's on the verge of decline, there's very little point for you to keep investing money into the business. So you pretty much stop all your investments and you harvest it, right? You try to get as much cash out of it as possible to do with it as you please. So you may invest some of it into your stars, you may invest some of it into your other kinds of businesses that we'll talk about in a sec. So businesses located in markets that grow fast, but we control very little of that market, these are question marks. Right? When you don't really have any market control, it is a cause for concern. It could be that other competitors will be more concentrated, that they will be able to push you out of this market altogether. So these are so-called question marks. These are the ones that you want to invest in to try to move them into a position of stars. The danger, obviously, is that they become dogs, right? So these are the kind of businesses where relative market share is low and they're not growing either. So that's the kind of business that makes absolutely no sense for you to maintain. So that's the first candidate for divestment. And based on how your portfolio is structured, some strategies make a lot more sense for you than others. Now, you may also analyze strategies based on the extent to which they are adaptive. And here we talk about three possible strategies: prospecting strategy, defending strategy, and analyzing strategy. With prospecting strategy, you're actively looking for new prospects. So you aggressively offer new products, new services, you enter new markets in pursuit of opportunities. This is something that a lot of people will associate with entrepreneurial orientation, right? So aggressiveness, proactiveness, innovativeness, those kind of things. Defending strategies is something entirely different, obviously. So here you try to stay with the present product line and markets and simply maintain or slowly increase customers in new markets. That is probably a better idea for family firms or entrepreneurial firms that do not have external shareholders that push them towards rapid expansion. If this is a lifestyle business for you, you reach a certain level, you're comfortable there, you make enough money, you have time to enjoy the money that you create. So, kind of if it works, don't fix it. So that's the essence of a defending strategy. And then finally, analyzing strategy is a mid-range approach, kind of like the combination of these two. You try to grow, just not quite as crazy, and you also try to protect whatever lines of businesses you have at the moment. Now, at the business level, the so-called competitive strategies, they have to do with how precisely you compete in a specific product market. So, in essence, they describe the nature of your competitive advantage. There are three, I would even say two, main sources of competitive advantage: either differentiation or cost leadership. With differentiation, you try to be unique. You try to offer something that no one else does or no one else can. So, if you happen to do that successfully, people would not mind to pay you extra for your products or your services, right? As long as you are unique enough. With cost leadership, you basically manufacture products or you do services that are just your average run-of-the-mill products, but you are the cheapest on the market, right? So in the first case, when you compete based on differentiation, you actually want to limit your sales. You want to limit the output because if you scale up too much, you're going to lose your uniqueness. If you cater to everyone, then the competition effectively becomes a competition on price. So with differentiation, you try to limit the scale. With cost leadership, you absolutely must to scale up because generally, whenever you double the outputs, your costs per unit of production go down 20 to 30%. So if you want to be a cost leader, you definitely want to scale up. And then finally, sometimes we also talk about customer focus as a distinct kind of a competitive strategy. So here you put stress on a specific regional market, specific product line, specific customer group. So you don't necessarily have to be the cheapest, but you have to tailor to that specific group that you target, right? So it's kind of, you don't try to appeal to anyone, but then within that group that you target, you definitely try to get, all the boxes checked. At the operational level, so planning here has to do with functional strategies that in turn have to do with different business functions. And we talked about that previously, right? So functions like marketing, operations, finance, human resources, IT, R&D, right? Things of that nature. With marketing strategy, it effectively boils down to the so-called 4 Ps. If you've taken any marketing classes, you know them by now. If not, 4 Ps stand for product, price, place, and promotion. Operation strategy, that would have to do with your logistics and specific, the layout of the facility. We'll talk about some of that towards the very end of the semester, so we'll revisit it. Finance strategies, obviously, has to do with where you get the money, how much of it is your equity, how much of it is borrowed. If it's borrowed, where do you borrow it from? If it's equity, how do you raise that capital? You go to, I don't know, venture capitalists. Do you try to find alternative financing sources? Um, Using leverage, making the best use of the money that you have. So you'll have a separate class, I think, corporate finance. We'll talk about a lot of those things. Human resource strategy goes without saying, you understand what that is. IT technology, research and development. So basically any function that you have within an organization, be that primary function or support function, could be described with the help of a specific functional strategy. And there are two groups of functions within the firm, primary and support. I believe we may have touched on that previously. So primary function, primary activities have to do with the transformation of inputs into outputs and then, customer service. Support activities do not necessarily have to do with this transformation of inputs into outputs, but they support the primary activities, right? So remember that. I believe we have discussed that. Types of plans. Three big groups, standing plans, single-use plans, and contingency plans. Standing plans are created for some standard processes, right? So things like policies or procedures or rules that you create within a company that could be applied towards many future situations, that would be an example of a standing plan. So, for instance, in HR, right, there are standard procedures you have to go through whenever you look for a person to hire, whenever you invite people for interviews, you identify the best candidates, you make them an offer. There are all those different boxes to check that are spelled out very precisely in those policies, rules, and procedures that you have to follow. Single-use plans are something different. They have to do with unique situations. So again, for instance, you decide to build a new plant somewhere in Arizona. So that is a one-off project, and those typical rules and policies would not help you much. You have to develop a plan that is tailored to that specific project. Budgets would also fall into this category because your budget from year to year definitely changes. You have to prepare it, anticipating specific development of a situation in that specific year. So while you may refer to it in the future when updating your budgets or coming up with the new ones, it will not be of the direct use to you in any way possible. And then finally, when we talk about contingency plans, a kind of what if scenario, we may have several options we can go after depending on how stars align. So that's the third kind of plan. And then obviously all of that activity, planning, strategy making requires a lot of time. And the big question for you as future managers is how exactly you manage your time. It turns out there is a very good approach that is very helpful if you stay true to what it suggests. So you have to really divide your tasks based on their urgency and importance. So again, this gives you a very simple 2 by 2 matrix with 4 quadrants, and you may have some tasks that are absolutely urgent and important. Something has to be done right now, and it's really, really important for your business. So that would be known as quadrant of necessity. So your business is facing a survival crisis. That obviously will be that. Project meetings, right? There are deadlines there. The project is important. That will fall here. Some last minute demands or deadline driven projects, they're both urgent and important. Hopefully, the majority of your tasks will fall into the second quadrant, something that is important but not urgent. So things like strategic planning, working towards goals that have been established some time ago, personal care, relationship building, recreation. These are all the things that are important to you as a person, as a professional, as an individual, but it's not urgent, right? Important, but not urgent. So you have a lot of flexibility. You can move things around as long as you don't really neglect that quadrant. So this is called the quadrant of quality. You may also have tasks that are urgent but unimportant, right? So any kind of interruptions, phone calls, emails, reports, certain minutes, they do take your time, they disrupt your other important activities, and for that reason, we call them this quadrant a quadrant of deception. So they appear deceivingly urgent, and we do not really reflect on the fact that they are not important to us. They could be important to someone, but not to us. So, we definitely should not concern ourselves with these ones much. And then finally, there are tasks that are neither urgent nor important. Things like web browsing, social media, Netflix, over analyzing certain things, right? You've heard about analysis paralysis, procrastination of any kind. So this is a quadrant of waste. This is the one that you definitely, definitely need to eliminate. So this one you try to eliminate at all cost. That quadrant of deception, you have to be honest with yourself and identify those tasks as such, and really prioritize them very low. Again, hopefully, the most of your tasks will be in the second quadrant, the quadrant of quality. So you dedicate substantial time to that as long as it is necessary. And then, of course, this quadrant of necessity, if you have a task that's both important and urgent, you have to drop everything else and do that. So, just having the structure in mind should guide you towards deciding which areas, which tasks to emphasize. And basically, I guess with the time management system, there are several elements that need to be in place for you to be effective. Right? You have to have priorities. Without priorities, everything is equally important, and you would never be able to decide what to do and what not to do. You have to have objectives because they would also guide your understanding of what's important, what's not. Right? So priorities maybe have to do with urgency. Objectives help you decide on the importance part. You have to have plans, right? Proper plans. This is what needs to be done. This is how we're going to do that. Then you have to have schedules. As they say, goals are dreams with deadlines. So you have to put those deadlines in. It's great if someone else gives you deadlines. I know that for me personally, this is very motivating. But you can also create those deadlines for yourself, right? And schedules. And if there are multiple parties involved, uh, making sure those schedules mesh together will require some effort. So work on that. And then you have to have some proper time management system. You have to plan each week, you have to schedule each week, and then you have to schedule each day. So it sounds kind of boring and maybe even scary and at times unnecessary, but I guarantee you, if you start doing that, your productivity will go up. Now, even just simply having a list of tasks for the day is a great help. I've been there, done that. I know for myself, I get a lot more done when I have those plans and schedules, and you'd be amazed if you try doing that. And finally, multitasking. That's the last concept I want to touch on today. I think we are all encouraged to multitask, to get more things done in the same time. And there's no evidence for multitasking to be effective, right? So generally, if you try to sit in two chairs, it's a very uncomfortable position. Now, there's some research that suggests females are more effective than males in multitasking. Well, that's very good, but generally, I think if you want to stay conservative, you want to work on one thing at a time and only move on to something else once you've completed the first task. It gives you a psychological boost. It gives you a sense of accomplishment. It teaches you something about yourself. It prepares you for what's next. So, multitasking could work for some people, but based on everything that researchers have seen in real life, it is probably not for everyone. So, I would try to discourage you from multitasking. And with that, I think our today's session is done. So feel free to email me with any questions you might have. Otherwise, I will see you next week.